The Dora. Someone tried to break into my car as I was sleeping. So I just left college in what could be voted as the most bizarre final year of college of all time. And I was to get a job. But there was a severe ice storm at my state, which froze up everything. Well, even so, the wind finally slowed down, and the streets were prepared so I could drive off to what would be the strangest first day of work. It was worse than I could imagine, but after a rather heinous day, I drove back home. They said a storm was going to hit, but it didn't hit till I got home. But nobody was in the house when I got there, and that locked the door. So, I was forced to wait in the car. There I slept. When I woke up, I was so surprised and disorientated. I was in a dark room and couldn't see a thing. I looked around, and only when I hit the steering wheel with my knee did I remember. I was in the car. And so I realized that the storm had fallen when I was still sleeping. I don't know how long I had been asleep or what time of the day it was. I grabbed the door handle and tried to open, but the thing wouldn't buckle. No matter how hard I tried, it just wouldn't move. At this point, the air got warmer due to my exertion, and I couldn't breathe. I leaned back and kicked the door as hard as I could, but the thing wouldn't budge. I finally stopped to try and catch my breath. But then the door kicked back. The door didn't grow a foot and kick me, of course. It's just that I heard a knocking sound coming from the door. Knock, 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 knock. It was methodical and strong. Someone was hitting the door from outside, trying to get in. I realized then that my brother must have gotten back, even though my phone said it was 6, and he usually got back from work at around 8. I yelled out at him, telling him to try hitting the window. But then something odd happened. The knocking stopped. I waited, but the knocking sound didn't return. Finally, I called to him, telling him this wasn't funny. But by now there was a sinking feeling that fed into my fears, that whoever was out there was gone, or whoever was out there wasn't going to open the door. The door knocked, and I let out a scream. Then there was a scratching sound, until I could see the sky from the window, and bloodshot eyes looked into my car. Eyes I had never seen before in my life. They disappeared again, and the knocking on the door returned with renewed vigor. The guy kicked the door, slammed the door, and must have thrown his body on it at some point. I was busy screaming and begging him to stop and not enter. I was trying to tell him that I was fine. Then, to my dismay, the door creaked open like an old rusty door. I jumped over and grabbed the handle of the door, pulling the door close. And we were stuck in that pose, with him working hard to open, and me doing everything in my power to close it. But then, there was a loud booming sound, and the guy ran off. I looked out, and there stood my brother. He asked I not tell mother about that, since he should have been home, or made a plan for me. I didn't, but when I walked out, I noticed there were footsteps by the door, walking away on the snow. The interner. A serial assaulter snuck into my home one late, snowy night. I am a doctor, but I wasn't always one. Once upon a time, I was an intern. During my intern years, I had to work in an asylum. I was also learning an additional course. I had to help watch the people at the psych ward sometimes, but not all the time. And every time I was there, I never had anything strange happen to me. That is, until this one specific day. It was snowy outside, but I was adamant to go about my day as I normally did. I would walk to the class and study for most of the day, then pass by my favorite store to get a ham sandwich, and I would get home to have some coffee with my sandwich. And on that day, it went the same, at least in the morning. I woke up and headed to class. After class, I returned and got my sandwich. Then, I started home. But even though it was late at night, I immediately noticed something was strange. I didn't like the way the dirt was on the floor, almost like someone had opened the door. But I thought this was just me overreacting. So I looked around a bit in embarrassment. But then I noticed it. The snow. There were footsteps on the snow that walked to my house and stopped at the walkway. Those footsteps headed to my door. I looked at the house again and tried to peek at the windows, but I am too short to reach them. Deciding to not walk into the house, I rather opted to go look for somebody who could help me. I found them, 2 guys to be exact, who were also in my class. They listened to my story, and it was only as I was telling it that I realized how ridiculous it all sounded. The other guy thought it was stupid too, though he didn't say it out loud. But his friend heard me out and said they could come help me, though the smile on his face told me that he thought this was something else other than what it actually was. When we finally got to my house, we opened the door, and the guy who believed me entered. "See?" he said. "There is no one." He switched on the light, and behind him stood someone. He jumped on him, pushing him to the wall, and then his friend woke up from his stupor and tried to help him. The 3 men fought and fell to the floor, rolling till they were outside. The guy who snuck into my house hurried to his feet and looked at me. Then he ran off before I could scream. The other 2 got up and gave chase to the guy. We called the cops, and the guy was arrested. He had escaped the asylum and was taken back. I would like to say I was pleased when the 2 guys apologized for not believing me, but I wasn't. I was just scared to continue living there anymore. So I moved out and went to live somewhere else. The digger. I was almost buried alive by a grave digger a while back. I don't know why, but ever since I could remember, I've been terrified of graveyards. It wasn't normal. It was so bad, I didn't even like seeing the pictures of the place. They made me cry when I was 4 or 5 years old. And wouldn't you know it, we had a massive grave next to our school. The place was so close to us, you could see it from math class. On that special day, I was sitting in class and doing my best to focus, but I couldn't stop looking at the graveyard. There was a grave digger out there, who also worked as our keeper of the fields. He was digging for some reason, then walking into the thick forest, returning to dig some more. What could he possibly be doing? He looked at me. He suddenly stopped digging, lifted his head, and looked at my window. I mean, he was so far I couldn't tell where his eyes were actually looking, but it was around my area. I quickly looked to the front of the class. I stayed like that for a few minutes, but then, when I gathered enough confidence, I glanced over again. He was right outside the window. I couldn't resist letting out a scream. The teacher went out and walked him back to the graveyard, as if carrying some kind of sick person who couldn't walk on his own, and the guy kept his hairy face firmly in my direction. The class laughed at me. I had made a fool out of myself, and they laughed at me for the rest of the day, till it was after school. As we were walking out of the school, some of my friends arrived and laughed at me about it, calling me a sissy. I told them I wasn't scared. I had just been surprised, that's all. They told me if that was the case, then they dared me to go get the shovel the guy had. The graveyard suddenly looked massive and dark, but I swallowed my fear and told them that I'd do it. But I was stopped by a friend of mine. She lived at the same place as me and had always been afraid. She told me not to do it, since the guy was actually insane. He had actually killed someone in the past, legend has it. So I told her fine, I wouldn't do it. Let's go home. But I told her I forgot my jacket, so she said she'd go get it, as I knew she would. When she was gone, I turned to the others and told them I was going into the graveyard. It was the worst decision of my life. Every time I stepped over a mound of dirt with a tombstone at the top, an electric jolt traveled up the skin of my legs and my hair stood up straight. I couldn't believe how stupid I was being and tried to look around the snowy graveyard for the shovel, but it wasn't there. When I'd made it across, I relaxed somewhat, but then I heard the sound of grunting and metal hitting something. Digging. He was digging from within the forest. The walk through the forest was the most stealthy I could have ever been. But suddenly, as I was nearing the opening, the digging stopped. I also came to a stop and was suddenly aware of how loud my breathing was. Calming down, I listened, but the digging didn't return. I looked through the leaves when it all got dark. When suddenly it all got dark, he jumped in front of me. He let out a loud, weird screech. It sounded like a screaming baby or an animal thing. I screamed and stumbled back, tripping on something really rough and landing on my behind, and I looked behind him to see what he'd been doing there. He'd been working on a new grave. I screamed louder, but he didn't attack. He fell on his knees and cupped dirt in his hands and flung it to me with the snow. I only realized when he got up and ran for the shovel that he had been trying to bury me. I got up and ran out of there as fast as I could, making it to the graveyard. By then, my friend, she was running to me. She grabbed my hand and helped me run out of there and into the laughing crowd. Well, I don't think I ever ignored her again.